The moving truck pulled away from the house on Maple Street, leaving behind a pile of empty boxes and the smell of fresh paint. 16-year-old Terrell wiped the sweat from his forehead as he watched his parents inspect their new front yard. After years of saving every penny, his family had finally bought their first house in Willowbrook, a quiet neighborhood where the lawns were perfectly trimmed and the mailboxes all looked the same. "This is it, son," his father Kevin said, putting a hand on Terrell's shoulder. "Our piece of the American dream." His mother Lisa smiled as she looked up at the 2-story house with its blue shutters and white picket fence. She had worked double shifts at the hospital for 3 years to make this move possible. Kevin had taken on weekend jobs at the auto shop, coming home with grease under his fingernails and exhaustion in his eyes. But it had all been worth it for this moment. Terrell nodded, but something felt different here. Back in their old neighborhood, he could walk down the street without anyone giving him a second look. Here, he noticed how conversations stopped when he passed by, how people suddenly found their phones very interesting when he made eye contact, how curtains seemed to move just a little bit when he walked past certain houses. The family next door had an older woman living alone. Mrs. Patterson was her name, according to the mailbox. She had gray hair pulled back in a tight bun and always wore cardigans even in the summer heat. Terrell first noticed her watching him from her kitchen window as he carried boxes from the car. When he waved, she quickly stepped back from the glass. "Maybe she's just shy," his mother said when Terrell mentioned it later that evening. They were sitting around their new dining table, eating pizza from paper plates because they hadn't unpacked the good dishes yet. "Or maybe she's never seen black folks in this neighborhood before," Kevin said quietly, taking a sip of his soda. "Kevin," Lisa warned, glancing at their son. "What? I'm just being honest. You see how some of these people look at us, like we don't belong here." Terrell had noticed it too. When they went to the grocery store earlier that day, the cashier had been polite but cold. The security guard had followed them down 3 different aisles. At the gas station, the attendant had asked to see Kevin's credit card twice, even though the machine had already approved the payment. But his parents had worked too hard for this house. They deserved to live here just like anyone else. The next morning, Terrell woke up early for his first day at Willowbrook High School. He had played basketball at his old school and hoped to make the team here too. Sports had always been his way of making friends and fitting in. He put on his favorite sneakers and grabbed his backpack, ready to start fresh. As he walked down the front steps, he noticed Mrs. Patterson in her garden. She was watering her roses, but her eyes were on him. When their gazes met, she didn't smile or wave. She just stared with a look he couldn't quite read. Was it curiosity? Suspicion? Fear? "Good morning," Terrell called out, trying to be friendly. Mrs. Patterson turned off her hose and went inside, without saying a word. The walk to school took 15 minutes through tree-lined streets where every house looked like it belonged in a magazine. Terrell passed other students heading to school, most of them white kids who drove their own cars or rode bikes that probably cost more than his family's monthly grocery budget. A few of them looked at him with the same expression Mrs. Patterson had given him that morning. At school, things weren't much better. Terrell found himself eating lunch alone, trying to figure out where he fit in. The basketball coach seemed interested when Terrell introduced himself, which gave him some hope. But in his classes, teachers called on him less often, and when they did, they seemed surprised when he gave good answers. After school, Terrell decided to walk home through the neighborhood park. He sat on a bench and pulled out his phone to text his friends from his old school. He missed the easy conversations and the feeling of belonging somewhere. Here, everything felt like a test he wasn't sure how to pass. "Are you lost?" Terrell looked up to see a police officer standing next to the bench. The man was middle-aged with a serious expression and his hand resting on his belt. "No, sir, I live here," Terrell said, pointing in the direction of his house. "Where exactly?" "Maple Street. The blue house with white shutters." The officer studied his face for a long moment. "What's your name, son?" "Terrell Johnson." "My family just moved here yesterday." "I see. Well, just make sure you're not causing any trouble." "I'm not causing trouble. I'm just sitting here." The officer nodded slowly. "Right, well, have a good day." As the police car drove away, Terrell felt his stomach twist into knots. He hadn't done anything wrong. He was just a kid sitting in a park after school. The same thing hundreds of other teenagers probably did every day. But somehow he was the one who got questioned. When he got home, his mother was in the kitchen unpacking dishes. She took one look at his face and knew something was wrong. What happened? Terrell told her about the police officer, about Mrs. Patterson ignoring his greeting, about feeling invisible at school except when people were staring at him. Lisa sat down next to her son and pulled him into a hug. I know it's hard, baby. Change is always difficult, especially when you're the only one who looks like you. Maybe Dad was right. Maybe we don't belong here. No, Lisa said firmly. We belong anywhere we want to live. We earned this house. We earned our place in this neighborhood. It's going to take time for people to get used to us, but we're not going anywhere. That evening at dinner, Kevin could see the frustration in his son's eyes. How was school? Different, Terrell said, pushing food around his plate. Different how? Just different. Everyone's watching me like I'm going to do something wrong. Kevin and Lisa exchanged glances. They had hoped things would be better for their son in this new place, but they were starting to realize that changing neighborhoods didn't automatically change people's minds. You know what your grandmother used to tell me? Kevin said. She said that sometimes you have to be twice as good to get half as much. It's not fair, but that's the world we live in. So I have to prove myself to people who don't even know me. That's exactly what you have to do. And you know what? You're strong enough to handle it. As Terrell went to bed that night in his new room, he could see Mrs. Patterson's house through his window. Her porch light was on, and he could see her silhouette moving past the windows. He wondered what she was thinking about. Whether she was worried about having new neighbors. Whether she was the type of person who judged others based on the color of their skin. He had no idea that in just a few weeks, Mrs. Patterson would become the biggest challenge his family had ever faced. Or that her suspicions about him would nearly destroy everything his parents had worked so hard to build. 3 weeks had passed since the Johnson family moved to Maple Street, and Mrs. Patterson found herself spending more time at her front window than ever before. She told herself she was just keeping an eye on the neighborhood, the way any responsible resident would do. But deep down, she knew her attention was focused on one house in particular. Every morning at 7:30, she watched Terrell leave for school. Every afternoon at 4:15, she watched him come home. Sometimes he carried a basketball. Sometimes he had his backpack slung over one shoulder. And sometimes, Mrs. Patterson noticed, he took different routes through the neighborhood. That boy is up to something, she muttered to herself one Tuesday afternoon as she watched Terrell walk past the Hendersons' house. She had lived on Maple Street for 42 years and knew every family, every routine, every normal pattern of life. This felt different. When packages started disappearing from front porches, Mrs. Patterson's suspicions grew stronger. First, it was Mrs. Chen's delivery from the online shopping site. Then Mr. Rodriguez's new garden tools went missing from his front step. The Williamses reported that their newspaper had been stolen 3 days in a row. Mrs. Patterson connected the dots in her mind. A new family moves in. A teenage boy starts walking around the neighborhood at different times. Things start going missing. It seemed obvious to her, even if no one else was paying attention. She began keeping a notebook, writing down every time she saw Terrell outside his house. 7:45 a.m., walking toward Oak Street. 3:55 p.m., returning from the direction of the park. 6:30 p.m., shooting baskets in his driveway. To Mrs. Patterson, these weren't the normal activities of a teenage boy. They were the suspicious movements of someone planning something. The first time she called the police, her hands shook as she dialed the number. I'd like to report suspicious activity in my neighborhood, she said when the dispatcher answered. What type of suspicious activity, ma'am? There's a young man, a black teenage boy, who's been walking around the neighborhood at unusual hours. Things have been going missing, and I think he might be involved. Has anyone seen him taking anything? Mrs. Patterson paused. Well, no, but he's always around when things disappear. The dispatcher took down her address and said an officer would drive by to check the area. Mrs. Patterson felt satisfied that she had done her civic duty. Officer Martinez arrived 20 minutes later, just as Terrell was walking home from basketball practice. The boy was wearing shorts and a t-shirt soaked with sweat, carrying a water bottle in his school backpack. To Officer Martinez, he looked like any other high school athlete heading home after practice. Excuse me, son, the officer called out. Terrell stopped and turned around, his heart immediately starting to beat faster. This was the second time in 3 weeks that a police officer had approached him for no reason he could understand. Yes, sir. I'm Officer Martinez. We had a report of someone acting suspiciously in this area. Do you live around here? Yes, sir. Right there. Terrell pointed to his house, which was clearly visible from where they stood. "Where are you coming from?"
"Basketball practice at school." Officer Martinez looked at the sweaty teenager with his sports bag and water bottle.
Nothing about this seemed suspicious, but he had to follow up on the call. "All right. Just make sure you're not bothering anyone, okay?" "I'm not bothering anyone, sir. I'm just trying to get home." After the officer left, Terrell stood in his driveway for a moment, trying to understand what had just happened. His father's car pulled up just as he was walking toward the front door. "Why was there a police car here?" Kevin asked as he got out of his car. "Some lady called about suspicious activity. The officer said someone reported seeing a black teenager acting suspicious." Kevin's jaw tightened. "What were you doing?" "Walking home from basketball practice. Same thing I do every day." That evening, Kevin and Lisa had a serious conversation with their son. "From now on," Lisa said, "I want you to be extra careful when you're outside. Don't give anyone any reason to think you're doing something wrong." "I'm not doing anything wrong," Terrell protested. "I know that. But some people might be looking for reasons to cause trouble for us." The police visits became more frequent. Mrs. Patterson called again when she saw Terrell sitting on the park bench after school, reading a book. She called when he was jogging early one Saturday morning. She called when he was helping his father carry groceries from the car. Each time, the responding officers found a polite, well-spoken teenager who was clearly doing nothing wrong. But each encounter left Terrell feeling more frustrated and isolated. "I can't even exist in my own neighborhood," he told his parents one evening. "Everything I do is suspicious to someone." The situation got worse when old Mr. Thompson's garden gnome disappeared from his front yard. Mrs. Patterson immediately called the police and specifically mentioned seeing that black boy walking past Mr. Thompson's house the day before. This time, Officer Davis responded to the call. Unlike Officer Martinez, Davis seemed to take Mrs. Patterson's concerns more seriously. "How long has this been going on?" he asked her. "Ever since that family moved in. I've been keeping track." She showed him her notebook with all the times and locations where she had seen Terrell. When Officer Davis approached Terrell later that day, his tone was different, more accusatory. "We've had multiple reports about you in this neighborhood," he said. "Reports about what?" "I live here. People are saying you've been casing houses, looking for things to steal." Terrell felt his face grow hot with anger and embarrassment. "That's not true. I've never stolen anything in my life." "Then why do people keep calling about you?" "I don't know. Maybe you should ask them." The encounter ended with Officer Davis warning Terrell to stay out of trouble and threatening to arrest him if any more complaints came in. When Terrell told his parents what happened, Kevin was furious. "This is harassment," he said. "We need to do something about this." "Like what?" Lisa asked. "Go to the police station and complain about the police?" "We could talk to the neighbors, try to clear up whatever misunderstanding this is." But when Kevin tried to approach Mrs. Patterson the next day, she refused to come to the door. When he knocked on other neighbors' doors, most of them were polite but distant. A few seemed genuinely surprised to learn that the police had been called multiple times about Terrell. "He seems like a nice kid," said Mrs. Williams, who lived 3 houses down. "Always says hello when I see him." But for every neighbor who defended Terrell, there seemed to be another who shared Mrs. Patterson's suspicions. The stress was taking its toll on the whole family. Terrell's grades started slipping because he couldn't concentrate in class. He quit trying out for the basketball team because he didn't want to draw any more attention to himself. Lisa was working extra shifts to pay for the new house. But the constant worry about her son was wearing her down. Kevin found himself checking the windows every time he heard a car door slam, wondering if it was another police visit. The American dream they had worked so hard to achieve was turning into a nightmare. "Maybe we should move," Lisa said one night after Terrell had gone to bed. "No," Kevin said firmly. "We're not running away. We didn't do anything wrong." But privately, Kevin was starting to wonder if they had made a mistake. Was it worth putting their son through this kind of stress just to live in a better neighborhood? The breaking point was coming, though none of them knew it yet. Mrs. Patterson's suspicions were about to escalate into something much more serious, something that would threaten to destroy everything the Johnson family had worked for, and the truth about what was really happening in the neighborhood was something no one could have expected. Mrs. Patterson had been particularly proud of her rose garden for over 20 years. Every spring she carefully pruned each bush, Every summer she watered them at dawn and dusk. Every fall she prepared them for winter with the dedication of someone tending to beloved children. The roses were her prized possession, the thing that made her house the most beautiful on Maple Street. That's why when she looked out her kitchen window on Thursday morning and saw the destruction, she felt like someone had punched her in the stomach. 6 of her prized rose bushes had been completely destroyed. The plants were uprooted and scattered across her front lawn. Soil was everywhere. Petals covered her driveway like confetti from a nightmare party. 20 years of careful gardening had been ruined in a single night. Mrs. Patterson stood in her bathrobe and slippers, staring at the mess, tears streaming down her face. Who could have done such a thing? Who would be so cruel as to destroy something that brought her so much joy? And then she saw movement next door. Terrell was leaving for school, walking down his front steps with his backpack and basketball. He glanced over at her yard, and Mrs. Patterson was certain she saw something in his expression. Was it guilt? Satisfaction? She couldn't be sure, but in that moment she was convinced she was looking at the person who had destroyed her garden. That's it, she said out loud. That's absolutely it. Mrs. Patterson called 911 immediately, not even bothering to get dressed first. This is an emergency, she told the dispatcher. Someone vandalized my property last night and I know who did it. Ma'am, vandalism isn't typically considered an emergency unless someone is in immediate danger. Someone destroyed my entire garden. 20 years of work gone. And I saw the boy who did it. He lives next door, and he's been causing trouble in this neighborhood for weeks. The dispatcher took down her information and said, officers would be sent to take a report. Detective Sarah Chen arrived an hour later with Officer Davis, who had responded to previous calls about Terrell. Mrs. Patterson met them at her front door, now dressed but still visibly upset. I want that boy arrested, she said before they could even introduce themselves. He destroyed my garden out of spite, and I'm not going to stand for it anymore. Detective Chen surveyed the damage to the rose garden. It was extensive and clearly deliberate. Someone had put considerable effort into destroying these plants. Do you have any evidence that your neighbor was involved? Detective Chen asked. I've been keeping track of his activities for weeks, Mrs. Patterson said, producing her notebook. He's been walking around the neighborhood at all hours. Things have been going missing, and now this. It's obvious he's targeting me because I've been reporting his suspicious behavior. Officer Davis nodded. We've had multiple calls about this kid. Maybe it's time we took a harder look at him. Detective Chen was more cautious. Has anyone actually seen him commit a crime? Well, no, Mrs. Patterson admitted. But who else could it be? This neighborhood was perfectly safe until his family moved in. Despite Detective Chen's reservations, the severity of the vandalism and the multiple previous complaints meant they had to investigate. They walked across the lawn to the Johnson house and knocked on the front door. Lisa answered, still in her nursing scrubs from the night shift at the hospital. Her heart sank when she saw the police officers standing on her porch. Mrs. Johnson, we need to speak with your son about an incident that occurred last night. What kind of incident? Vandalism. Your neighbor's garden was destroyed and she believes your son might be involved. Lisa felt the blood drain from her face. Terrell would never do something like that. He's been taught to respect other people's property. Ma'am, we still need to speak with him. Terrell was called downstairs. When he saw the police officers, he immediately knew this was more serious than the previous encounters. Detective Chen introduced herself and explained the situation. Where were you last night between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m.? She asked. In my room, asleep. I had a chemistry test this morning, so I went to bed early. Can anyone verify that? My parents were here, but they were asleep too. Officer Davis stepped forward. Son, we've had multiple reports about you acting suspiciously in this neighborhood. Now someone's property has been destroyed. If you're responsible for this, it's better to tell us now. I didn't destroy anyone's garden, Terrell said, his voice shaking with emotion. I would never do something like that. Then you won't mind if we search your room and look around your property for evidence, Officer Davis said. Lisa started to object, but Kevin, who had been called home from work, told the officers they could search whatever they wanted because they had nothing to hide. The search turned up nothing. No soil under Terrell's fingernails. No garden tools hidden in his room. No evidence whatsoever that he had been involved in the vandalism. But Mrs. Patterson wasn't satisfied. When the officers returned to give her the results, she became even more agitated. Of course you didn't find anything. He's smart enough to get rid of the evidence. But I know it was him. I can feel it. Detective Chen tried to reason with her. Ma'am, without any physical evidence or witnesses, we can't arrest someone based on suspicion alone. So he's just going to get away with this? We'll continue investigating. If we find any evidence linking your neighbor to this crime, we'll take appropriate action. But the damage was already done. Word of the police search spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Some residents were sympathetic to the Johnson family, recognizing that being searched without evidence was unfair. But others began to wonder if there might be some truth to Mrs. Patterson's accusations. At school, things became unbearable for Terrell. Somehow news of the police investigation had reached his classmates. Teachers looked at him differently. Students whispered when he walked down the hallways. The basketball coach, who had been encouraging him to try out for the team, suddenly seemed less interested. Maybe you should focus on your academics this year instead of sports, the coach suggested when Terrell asked about tryouts. The isolation was crushing. Terrell had never felt so alone in his life. At his old school, he had been popular and well-liked. Here, he was treated like a criminal for no reason other than the color of his skin and one woman's unfounded suspicions. I can't take this anymore, he told his parents one evening. Every time I leave the house, I feel like people are watching me, waiting for me to do something wrong. Kevin tried to stay strong for his son, but inside he was breaking too. We're going to get through this, son. The truth will come out eventually. What if it doesn't? What if people always think I'm guilty? Lisa pulled her son into a hug, fighting back tears. Then we'll move. We'll start over somewhere else. But you worked so hard for this house. Houses don't matter, Lisa said. You matter. Your happiness and safety matter more than anything. That night, Kevin and Lisa lay awake discussing their options. They had used their entire savings as a down payment on the house. Moving so soon would mean losing thousands of dollars and starting over with damaged credit. But watching their son suffer was worse than any financial loss. Let's give it one more month, Kevin suggested. If things don't improve, we'll put the house on the market. They didn't know that Mrs. Patterson was also lying awake, wrestling with her own doubts. Part of her was absolutely certain that Terrell had destroyed her garden. But a small voice in the back of her mind kept asking uncomfortable questions. What if she was wrong? What if her suspicions were based on something other than facts? She thought about her late husband, who had always warned her about jumping to conclusions. Evidence, not assumptions, he used to say when she would complain about neighbors or co-workers. But Harold had been gone for 5 years now, and Mrs. Patterson had been making more and more assumptions about the world around her. Still, someone had destroyed her roses. If it wasn't Terrell, then who was it? The answer to that question was closer than anyone realized. In fact, the real culprit had been watching the entire drama unfold from a hiding place that no one suspected. And soon the truth would come out in a way that would shock everyone involved, especially Mrs. Patterson herself. The breaking point had been reached, but the real story was just beginning to unfold. Mrs. Patterson couldn't sleep. 3 weeks had passed since her roses were destroyed, and the police investigation had gone nowhere. Detective Chen had called twice to update her, but both times the message was the same. No new evidence, no arrests, no justice for her ruined garden. The uncertainty was eating away at her. During the day, she found herself staring out the window at the Johnson house, watching for any sign of suspicious activity. At night, she lay in bed listening to every sound, wondering if someone was outside planning more destruction. I need to know the truth, she said to herself one Tuesday morning as she stood in her kitchen, looking at the empty patch of soil where her roses used to bloom. That afternoon, Mrs. Patterson drove to the electronics store in the shopping center across town. She had never bought anything more complicated than a new television, but she was determined to solve this mystery herself. I need a security camera, she told the young salesman, something that can record what happens in my front yard at night. The salesman, whose name tag read Dylan, showed her several options. Mrs. Patterson chose a simple system with 2 cameras that could record to a small device and also send alerts to her phone. Will this show me everything that happens outside my house? She asked. Yes, ma'am. It has night vision and motion detection. If anything moves in your yard, you'll know about it. Dylan helped her load the equipment into her car and even offered to install it for her. Mrs. Patterson accepted gratefully, realizing she had no idea how to set up something so technical. The installation took 2 hours. Dylan placed one camera above the front door and another on the side of the house facing the Johnson family's property. He showed Mrs. Patterson how to view the recordings on her phone and computer. "Now you'll have peace of mind," he said as he packed up his tools. That night, Mrs. Patterson felt more secure than she had in weeks. Whatever was happening in her neighborhood, she would finally have proof. If Terrell or anyone else came near her property, she would catch them in the act. For the first 3 nights, nothing happened. The cameras recorded the usual activity: neighbors walking their dogs, delivery trucks, kids riding bikes. Mrs. Patterson began to wonder if whoever had destroyed her roses had moved on to terrorizing someone else. But on Saturday night, everything changed. Mrs. Patterson was awakened at 2:30 in the morning by the alert sound on her phone. Someone was moving around in her front yard. She grabbed her phone and opened the camera app, her heart pounding with excitement and fear. At first, she couldn't see anything clearly. The night vision made everything look green and ghostly. But then a figure moved into view near her front steps, and Mrs. Patterson gasped. It wasn't Terrell. It wasn't anyone from the Johnson family. The person creeping around her yard was someone she knew very well. Someone who was supposed to be 300 miles away at college. It was her grandson. Brandon. Mrs. Patterson stared at the screen in disbelief. Brandon was supposed to be in his 2nd year at State University. She had talked to him on the phone just 2 weeks ago, and he had told her about his classes and his part-time job at the campus bookstore. What was he doing here in the middle of the night? She watched as Brandon approached her front door and appeared to be trying different keys. After a few minutes, he succeeded in opening the door and disappeared inside the house. Mrs. Patterson sat in her bed, frozen with confusion and fear. How did Brandon have keys to her house? Why was he sneaking around like a burglar in his own grandmother's home? She heard footsteps downstairs moving through her kitchen and living room. Cabinet doors opened and closed. Drawers were pulled out and pushed back in. It sounded like someone was searching for something. After about 20 minutes, the footsteps approached the stairs. Mrs. Patterson quietly locked her bedroom door and listened as Brandon moved around the guest room down the hall. She heard him talking quietly on his phone, though she couldn't make out the words. An hour later, everything went quiet. Mrs. Patterson checked her phone and saw Brandon leaving through the front door, carrying a small bag she hadn't noticed him bring in. The next morning, Mrs. Patterson reviewed all the camera footage from the past month. What she discovered made her feel sick to her stomach. Brandon had been coming to her house regularly, always in the middle of the night, always letting himself in with keys she didn't remember giving him. The timestamp showed he had been there the night her roses were destroyed. The cameras clearly recorded him walking through her garden, pulling up plants and throwing them across the lawn in what looked like a fit of rage. But that wasn't the worst part. The footage also showed Brandon leaving her house with packages that had been delivered to neighbors' porches. Mrs. Patterson watched in horror as her own grandson stole Mr. Rodriguez's garden tools, Mrs. Chen's online shopping delivery, and Mr. Thompson's decorative garden gnome. Brandon had been living in her house without her knowledge, stealing from the neighborhood, and letting an innocent family take the blame for his crimes. Mrs. Patterson's hands shook as she saved the video files to her computer. She had spent weeks convinced that Terrell was responsible for the neighborhood's problems. She had called the police multiple times. She had caused a family to be harassed and investigated. And all along, the real criminal had been her own grandson. She tried calling Brandon's cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. She called the university, but they told her that Brandon had dropped out 6 weeks ago and was no longer enrolled. 6 weeks ago, right around the time the problems in the neighborhood had started, Mrs. Patterson realized that Brandon must have been kicked out of school and was too ashamed to tell her. Instead of going home to face his parents, he had been hiding in her house, probably coming and going while she was asleep or running errands. The destroyed roses made sense now, too. Mrs. Patterson remembered the last conversation she had with Brandon. He had called asking for money to pay for textbooks, and she had refused, telling him that his parents were already sacrificing enough to pay for his education. He had hung up angry, and she hadn't heard from him since. Until now, she hadn't connected his anger with the destruction of her garden. But the video evidence was clear. Brandon had taken out his frustration on the thing he knew would hurt her most. Mrs. Patterson spent the rest of Sunday trying to process what she had learned. Her grandson, The boy she had raised during summers and holidays, the child she had taught to ride a bike and helped with homework, was a thief and a vandal, and worse, she had allowed an innocent family to be blamed for his crimes. The shame was overwhelming. Mrs. Patterson thought about all the times she had called the police about Terrell, all the suspicion and fear she had directed at a boy who was just trying to live his life in peace, all the assumptions she had made based on nothing more than the color of his skin and her own prejudices. She had to make this right, but she didn't know how. How do you apologize for destroying someone's reputation? How do you take back weeks of harassment and suspicion? On Monday morning, Mrs. Patterson called Detective Chen. "I need to speak with you immediately," she said. "I have new evidence about the vandalism case." "What kind of evidence?" "Video footage. I know who really destroyed my garden, and it wasn't my neighbor." Detective Chen arrived an hour later. Mrs. Patterson showed her all the camera footage, explaining about Brandon's secret presence in her house and his theft from the neighborhood. "Ma'am, are you telling me that you've been falsely accusing your neighbor while your own grandson was committing these crimes?" Mrs. Patterson nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I was so wrong. I let my assumptions cloud my judgment, and I ruined that family's life." Detective Chen studied the video evidence carefully. The footage clearly showed Brandon destroying the roses and stealing packages. It was more than enough to close the case and shift the investigation away from Terrell. "We'll need to arrest your grandson," Detective Chen said gently, "and we'll need to clear your neighbor's name officially." "I understand. I just want to do the right thing now." But Mrs. Patterson knew that arresting Brandon and clearing Terrell's name was only the beginning. The real challenge would be facing the Johnson family and trying to repair the damage she had caused through her prejudice and assumptions. The truth was finally coming out, but it was more painful than Mrs. Patterson had ever imagined. Mrs. Patterson sat in her living room for 3 hours after Detective Chen left, staring at the printed screenshots from her security camera. The images showed Brandon clearly destroying her roses, stealing packages, and sneaking through her house like a stranger. But more than that, they showed the truth about her own behavior over the past 2 months. She had been wrong about everything. Completely, utterly wrong. The hardest part wasn't accepting that Brandon had been living secretly in her house, or that he had committed crimes in the neighborhood. The hardest part was facing the ugly truth about her own assumptions and prejudices. She had seen a black teenager moving into her neighborhood and immediately assumed he was dangerous. She had watched his normal, everyday activities and interpreted them as suspicious. She had called the police on an innocent boy multiple times based on nothing more than her own fears and biases. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, Mrs. Patterson made the most difficult decision of her life. She walked across her lawn to the Johnson family's front door and knocked. Lisa answered, and Mrs. Patterson could see the wariness in her eyes. After weeks of police visits and neighborhood suspicion, Lisa had good reason to be cautious around the woman who had been their primary accuser. "Mrs. Johnson," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice shaking. "I need to speak with your family. I have something very important to tell you." Lisa hesitated for a moment, then opened the door wider. "Please come in." Kevin and Terrell were in the living room watching television. Both of them looked surprised to see Mrs. Patterson standing in their doorway. The last few months had built up so much tension that having her in their home felt surreal. "I owe you an apology," Mrs. Patterson began, her words barely above a whisper. "Actually, I owe you much more than that. I owe you the truth." She pulled out her phone and showed them the security camera footage. As the family watched Brandon destroying the rose garden and stealing packages from neighbors' porches, Mrs. Patterson explained everything she had discovered. "This is my grandson, Brandon. He dropped out of college 6 weeks ago and has been living in my house without my knowledge. He's been stealing from the neighborhood and committing vandalism. And I blamed your son for all of it." The room was silent for a long moment. Terrell stared at the phone screen, watching video evidence of crimes he had been accused of committing. Kevin and Lisa exchanged glances, processing the enormity of what they were hearing. "Your grandson did all this?" Kevin asked finally. "Yes. And I was so blinded by my own prejudices that I couldn't see the truth. I saw Terrell walking around the neighborhood and assumed he was up to no good, when really he was just being a normal teenager. I called the police on him multiple times for doing absolutely nothing wrong." Tears were streaming down Mrs. Patterson's face now. "I destroyed your family's peace of mind. I made your son feel like a criminal in his own neighborhood. I caused you weeks of stress and fear, all because I made assumptions based on the color of his skin. Terrell spoke for the first time since Mrs. Patterson had arrived. Why did you think it was me? The question was simple, but it cut straight to the heart of everything that had happened. Mrs. Patterson looked at this polite, intelligent young man and realized she had no good answer. Because I was afraid of change, she said honestly. This neighborhood has been the same for so long, and when your family moved in, I felt threatened. I let my fear turn into suspicion, and I convinced myself that you were dangerous when you were just trying to live your life. But I never did anything wrong, Terrell said, his voice filled with hurt and confusion. I know that now. I should have known it then. There was never any real evidence against you, just my own unfounded fears and prejudices. Lisa spoke up, her voice carefully controlled. Do you understand what you put us through? Do you realize that my son started having panic attacks because he was afraid to leave the house? That we considered moving because of the harassment? I know, Mrs. Patterson said, and I know that saying I'm sorry isn't enough. But I want to make this right if you'll let me. Kevin leaned forward in his chair. How do you make something like this right? I've already given all the evidence to the police. They're going to arrest Brandon and officially clear Terrell's name, but I also want to tell everyone in the neighborhood what really happened. I want to make sure every person who heard me accuse your son knows that I was wrong. Mrs. Patterson reached into her purse and pulled out a list of phone numbers. These are all the neighbors I spoke to about Terrell. I'm going to call every single one of them and explain the truth. I'm also going to talk to the police officers who responded to my calls and make sure they understand that Terrell was completely innocent. Over the next 2 days, Mrs. Patterson kept her word. She made dozens of phone calls, admitting her mistakes and clearing Terrell's name with everyone she had spoken to. Some neighbors were understanding and appreciative of her honesty. Others were shocked to learn how wrong she had been. A few were angry at her for causing so much unnecessary drama in the neighborhood. The conversation with Officer Davis was particularly difficult. He had been the most aggressive in his interactions with Terrell, and Mrs. Patterson made sure he understood the impact of his behavior. That boy did nothing wrong, she told him firmly. Nothing. And you treated him like a criminal based on my unfounded suspicions. That's not acceptable. Mrs. Patterson also went to Terrell's school and spoke with the principal and basketball coach, explaining the situation and asking them to reconsider any negative impressions they might have formed about Terrell during the investigation. But the most important conversation happened the following weekend, when Mrs. Patterson visited the Johnson family again. This time she brought something with her: college application materials and scholarship information she had researched specifically for Terrell. I used to be a guidance counselor, she explained. I retired 10 years ago, but I still know how to help students plan for their futures. I'd like to help Terrell with his college applications if he's interested. Terrell looked skeptical. After everything that had happened, it was hard to trust Mrs. Patterson's motives. Why would you want to help me? Because I owe you more than an apology. I owe you action. I spent weeks trying to tear down your reputation. Now I want to spend time building it up. Over the following months, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Patterson became one of Terrell's biggest supporters in the neighborhood. She helped him with his college essays, wrote recommendation letters, and even drove him to campus visits when his parents couldn't get time off work. The relationship was awkward at first. Trust had to be rebuilt slowly, carefully, but gradually Terrell began to see that Mrs. Patterson's commitment to making amends was genuine. She's not the same person who called the police on me, he told his parents one evening. I think she really learned something from all this. Mrs. Patterson had indeed learned something profound about herself and her community. She started attending neighborhood diversity meetings and volunteering with local organizations that worked to combat racial prejudice. She became an advocate for the very family she had once tried to drive away. Brandon was arrested and charged with multiple counts of theft and vandalism. The legal process was painful for Mrs. Patterson, but she never wavered in her support for justice. She testified against her own grandson and helped ensure that the Johnson family was completely cleared of any suspicion. The biggest change, though, was in the neighborhood itself. Mrs. Patterson's public admission of her mistakes sparked conversations that had been long overdue. Neighbors began talking openly about unconscious bias and the assumptions they made about each other. Some families reached out to the Johnsons for the first time, apologizing for their silence during the harassment. 6 months after the truth came out, Terrell received acceptance letters from 3 universities, along with a partial scholarship to his first-choice school. At his graduation party, Mrs. Patterson was one of the guests, sitting next to Terrell's parents and cheering as loudly as anyone when his name was called. "I'm proud of you," she told him afterward, "not just for your academic achievements, but for how you handled everything that happened. You showed more grace and maturity than many adults would have." "Thank you," Terrell said, "and thank you for proving that people can change." The story of what happened on Maple Street became a powerful lesson for the entire community. It showed how quickly fear and prejudice can destroy innocent lives, but also how courage and honesty can lead to redemption and understanding. Mrs. Patterson never forgot the shame of her actions, but she used that shame as motivation to become a better person and a better neighbor. The roses in her garden grew back more beautiful than ever, but the most important thing that grew was her understanding of the harm that prejudice can cause and the healing that comes from facing the truth. Terrell went on to college with a renewed sense of confidence and purpose. The experience had been painful, but it had also shown him the importance of standing up for what's right and the power of forgiveness. And the neighborhood of Willowbrook became a better place, not because it avoided difficult conversations about race and prejudice, but because it faced them head-on and chose to learn and grow from the experience.